there! I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my reading of the past 10 or so days. We went to see The Black Drum, which is a play that Soul Pepper Theatre put on along with the Deaf Cultural Center. And I thought I'd mention that because the playwright was Adam Pottle, whose novellas, poetry, and memoir I've all talked about in different wrap-ups over the past year. This was a really interesting experience. It's an ASL musical and was conceived as a sign language musical, so there is no vocal singing in it, and there is no music that isn't bass or rhythm based. So it was really interesting. So it was definitely something that is not intended for a hearing audience and then adapted for a sign language speaking deaf audience. It is conceived as a product for a deaf audience, which was really interesting. I haven't seen anything like that before. It's funny because I saw it because I'm a fan of the writer, but I thought the plot was the most generic part of it. It was a really interesting experience. So if you have an opportunity to see that, it's definitely worthwhile, so I thought I'd mention that. So the first book that I read during this period is one that I should be able to hold up in physical form, but I can't figure out what I did with the library book, which is slightly distressing because I'd rather not have fines on this. This is the Satapur Moonstone, which is the second novel in Sujata Massey's series of mysteries that are set in 1920 northern India. In this one, our sleuth, who is the only female solicitor in Bombay, and she's sent out to one of the semi-independent princely states. This is one that's fictionalized, but it's based on a few real ones. And she goes out to see what's happened about a child ruler whose mother and grandmother are not exactly in power. Anyway, mystery ensues. Maybe people have been murdered, maybe not. And she's going to be advising the colonial government on things and has political opinions about the fact that she's advising the colonial government. The mystery elements I thought were pretty well done. There are a few nicely done misleading elements that I thought were handled really well. One of the things that I liked about the first novel that continues in this is that it really captures a lot of the religious and cultural diversity, because the main character is Parsi, but a lot of the people that she interacts with are not. And so you really do have that plurality of ethnicities and religions and caste and class and all of that. A lot of mystery series have a kind of romantic element to them, and because the character is not quite divorced but separated from her husband in a situation where she probably can't be divorced, one might imagine that there wouldn't be a romance in this series, especially given things that happen in the first novel, but there is a colonial administrator who is clearly being set up to be a love interest, and I always say I'm not much one for shipping, as they say, but I'm kind of charmed by the two of them together. And I kind of love that it's a First World War veteran character who is an amputee, but not because of the war. So I thought that was interesting. I thought a lot of the yoga stuff was a little ridiculous because there's some of that in there, but I do think this style of mystery does tend to have a bit of everything plus the kitchen sink in them, so that's okay. Yeah, I was charmed by this. It's just a fun series that has a lot of different elements in it that I appreciated, and that I think works on a couple of different levels while still being a fluffy mystery. And I just hope that I can figure out what I did with the library book, because, as I said, I don't want to pay fines. Next up are a couple of books that I mentioned in my TBR for the Read the Middle East readathon. The first of which is The Apartment in Bab el-Louk, which is written by Donia Maher and illustrated in two parts by two different artists, because the first part is a kind of, it's described as a noir poem, but it's essentially about the perspective of a man listening to his neighbors and neighborhood happenings from his apartment, with some non-standard style illustrations. And then we have an epilogue, which is a more standard comic style, which is done by a separate artist. This is a really short piece, and I really enjoyed this. This was also the pick this month for Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures Read Around the World Book Club. I did go and read the Goodreads thread, although I haven't commented yet, and I feel like I enjoyed this a lot more than other people did. I found it particularly atmospheric, but it probably helped that I was sitting in my backyard as I was reading this, which meant that I was listening to, there were some teenagers down the street playing basketball, they're still doing this hydro line construction that I've been complaining about for months, so that was going on. So there were noises to be thinking about as the main character in the first part is thinking about the noises in his neighborhood. So yeah, I thought this was well done for what it is. There isn't necessarily enough meat to this to really dig down into something, but I thought for what it was trying to do, I was quite impressed. And because of the way the text and pictures are laid out, I would love to see this in the original, just because the directionality of English and Arabic are different, so it would have been interesting to see the non-translated version. But as I said, when I looked at the Read Around the World book club thread, I think other people were not as impressed by that as I was. Another book that I talked about in that TBR was Laila Aljohani's Days of Ignorance. It was translated by Nancy Roberts, and this is another short piece, somewhat more traditional than that, although definitely not something that is plot-driven. The background of this is that there is a couple whose families haven't sanctioned their relationship. The woman is around 30, which is old within a Saudi context to not be married, and her romantic partner is a man who was born in Saudi but doesn't have citizenship because his parents were from, they don't mention the country, although it's somewhat implied that they might be Sudanese. And her brother, who is 10 years younger and has clearly too much time on his hands and too many issues, has gone with a friend and beaten up her romantic interest, primarily for racial reasons because it's a black guy, but somewhat for class reasons as well. And we basically get chapters that are not exactly point of view chapters, but that are clearly framed from the experience of the woman, of her partner, and of her brother, their kind of backstories and the expectations that have led them to the particular place. There isn't any kind of reconciliation at the end, and there isn't any kind of payoff to the situation. It's just pieces that show how we've gotten to this place. So it's not particularly satisfying, but it's interesting to see the mindset that has led them to the places that they've ended up in. So I thought this was interesting more than it was necessarily good or engaging. And I know on Goodreads I looked at this and the reviews are quite poor for it because I think it is unsatisfying. I think you would look at this and expect there to be some kind of plot progression, and there really isn't. But I don't think it's intended to have plot progression, so I think it's going in with unrealistic expectations if you're looking for that. That said, if you're interested in this kind of presentation of mindset, I did think this was quite interesting. I did think this was worthwhile from that perspective, just knowing that it's not necessarily meant to give you a plot or give you an education, which I think is what a lot of people would approach something like this from the perspective of, which I think is maybe a mistake. Despite the fact that it wasn't satisfying, I was interested enough to keep going with it, and yeah, I'm glad I read it, but because it's not particularly engaging, I don't know that it's going to be particularly memorable over the long term. Next up, I read a comic book, which I've seen a fair number of people talking about on BookTube. This is an image book called Crude. It's written by Christopher Sebela, and the art is by a couple of different artists. I like the art significantly better than I like the way the story plays out. This is set in basically a near future in which there is an app on which people can basically order an assassination. And we have a character who's had an assassination, a hit put out on her on this app, and she hires a bodyguard, and this bodyguard has a ex-girlfriend who's in the police. She has secrets in her own life. They both have secrets in their lives. And they are basically just dodging assassination attempts. The action sequences I thought were quite well done. I enjoyed the art style in it. I enjoyed the way action was portrayed. The problem is that because these two characters have so many secrets, that could be played with in a way that would build suspense and make one more engaged with the story because you'd wonder more about what's happened. But because this was fairly long and we basically never find out basically any of the backstory of the woman who's had the hit taken out on her, I stopped caring about her story and I just was not interested in that. We find out somewhat more about the bodyguard character, so I enjoyed her interactions with people a little bit more just because there was something more to it, but we get so little about this one, about the other character throughout this entire volume that I just didn't care. And I think, now this is an ongoing series, so presumably eventually there will be backstory on her, but reading this as a collection, I found it distinctly unsatisfying despite the fact that I enjoyed the action sequences and the art style. And this is definitely a series that if I were buying, I wouldn't continue with the next one. I have been reading them through Hoopla at the library, so I might try the next one, although now that our Hoopla allocation has been dropped, I don't know that I will. But the art was good, and your tolerance for characters with promised backstory that never pays off may vary, so you might enjoy this quite a bit more than I did, because looking at the reviews, I think quite a few people did enjoy this more than I did, so. And then finally I read another comic, and that was Crude. This is written by Steve Orlando and drawn by Garry Brown. It is basically the story of an ex-hitman type Russian character who, after his son is murdered, goes to this oil rig kind of situation to find out what happened to his son and to seek revenge. As an action story, I found it reasonably entertaining, and the art kept up with that. As a family piece, it was a little bit ridiculous. The basic backstory is that the father hid the fact that he was a hitman from his family, so his son thought he was an insurance salesman and wouldn't understand him. And his son was involved in basically polyamorous bisexual relationships and felt that his father probably wouldn't have understood that. But because there isn't any kind of relationship building to the background, all of that felt a little flat to me. Because almost all of that is portrayed in a few nude scenes, it just seemed more, I don't want to say exploitive, because I don't think that's necessarily the right way to do it. I felt in a lot of ways that this was similar to, if you've read Steve Orlando's Virgil, which he calls a queersploitation comic, which is basically about a Jamaican cop whose boyfriend has been kidnapped, just like murdering people left and right. So there's some implied social commentary, but it's mostly an excuse for extreme violence. This is sort of similar in tone to that because it has a Russian setting. It also made me think of Steve Orlando's run on Midnighter, because there were bits in that where Midnighter goes to Russia and beats people up. But I would say that both Virgil and the Midnighter run were a lot better than this was. It was reasonably entertaining in terms of the action sequences, but the story stuff was just ridiculous. It was silly. It didn't land properly. There is the art style, which I did think was decent enough. Definitely one that I would call good enough, but not particularly great. I also have a number of things ongoing at the moment, but I guess I will do that in a separate video. I hope you've had a good week. If you're in Canada and you're having a long weekend, I hope you have a good long weekend. And everybody else, I hope you have a good regular weekend. And as always, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. And yeah, that's it for now.